Hi, this is Sarah Becktel, and welcome back to Week 3 of Strathmore's Colored Pencil with Mixed Media Workshop. In this lesson, we'll be focusing on enhancing colored pencil with watercolor. I'll be working on Strathmore's 500 series mixed media board that has been toned with fluid acrylic. If you need a review on how I toned my boards, please check back to Lesson 1. Today I'll be working on a red fox in a misty landscape, which I drew out on sketch paper and then transferred onto my final board. I demonstrated how to transfer a drawing in last week's video, so if you need a refresher on how to do that, you can check out Lesson 2. I'll be working on the landscape behind my fox first, so I'm lightening those pencil lines. I try to keep my graphite as light as possible so that it doesn't mix into my other mediums and muddy the color. Also, once I paint over graphite lines with watercolor, they become difficult or impossible to erase, so keeping the graphite light is just a good habit to have while working with watercolor. I want this landscape to appear foggy and overcast. As I mentioned in Lesson 1, I frequently use watercolor to create misty or atmospheric effects. Even after watercolor has dried, it can be re-wet and then further manipulated, blended, or reworked. This makes it a very forgiving medium for when I'm trying to create soft edges and gradations. So I'm going to start with watercolor to lay in my foggy landscape, and then I'll layer colored pencil on top of it. I'll be using golden core watercolors, and my palette includes a warm and a cool version of each of the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, plus a selection of earth colors and sap green. The first thing I'm going to do is block in the shrubs. For this, I'm mixing a gray with blue-green undertones. As I'm mixing and applying the watercolor, I have a small scrap of mixed media paper that I'm using to test colors before I apply them to my drawing. I also frequently blot my brush on the paper towels. I'm doing this to test and control the amount of paint and water loaded on the brush. If it feels as though I have too much fluid in my brush, I'll quickly dab it on the paper towel, which will absorb some of the excess watercolor out of the brush. However, there's no right or wrong amount of paint to have on your brush. Some artists prefer to have a really wet brush, and others work with more of a dry brush. In general, objects that are farther away lose detail and color saturation, which is referred to as atmospheric perspective. This effect is further accentuated with the presence of fog, so I'm making the farthest shrub the lightest in color and value, and as I work towards the foreground of my drawing, the shrubs will get darker. The first shrub is just a few values darker than the tone of my board. I'm using a number 8 round brush made with synthetic filament. I prefer round brushes because they hold lots of paint and water in the thicker part of the brush, so I'm able to distribute a good quantity of paint on my paper before running out. But the thin, sharp point at the end gives me control and allows me to get tiny details, so I get a lot of versatility with just one brush. I'm adding more paint for the second shrub to make it a little bit darker. I'm not adding any detail to these shrubs. I'm basically just leaving them as a flat color because if you were viewing trees or bushes through fog, they would lose all of their detail and you wouldn't be able to distinguish individual branches or leaves. For the third shrub, I'll again make the paint even darker so that one appears closer than the other two. In the second lesson, I discussed combining fluid acrylic with colored pencil. I could absolutely use thin, transparent acrylic to get the same look that I'm creating with my watercolor right now. But when acrylic dries, it's permanent and can't be reworked. And when I'm doing work like this landscape, I like having the option of being able to rework areas. As my shrubs dry, if there are any edges that feel too hard, I can go back in with a wet brush to soften or blend them. After my 3 shrubs are blocked in, I'm mixing a light neutralized green color to suggest the other grasses and brush in my landscape. Rather than just blocking in a flat wash, I'm laying down the color with small strokes to suggest tall grass and clumps of vegetation. I'm keeping the paint very light, and as I work, I frequently clean off my brush so I can use a wet brush with no paint to blend out the edges. As I work towards the front, I'm applying more paint to make the color darker, and I'm adding more detail to my clumps of grass. I'm adding thin lines to suggest individual blades of grass, which you wouldn't be able to see in the areas of the landscape that are farther away. Once I get my landscape blocked in, I'm going to start working on my fox. I'm lightening my pencil with a kneaded eraser, just like I did with the landscape, and I'm starting my fox in the same way that I started my jackrabbit in Lesson 2. I have a handful of colored pencils picked out that I'm going to use, but I may grab some additional colors as I need them. I'm building up the colored pencil slowly and keeping my layers thin. You can still see lighter specks where the paper is showing through my colored pencil, but that's what I want at this point. After I apply some base layers of colored pencil, I'm going to apply watercolor on top. And for that to work, I need my colored pencil to be thin enough that the watercolor can sink through the pencil and down into the paper. If I have a thick waxy coating of colored pencil, the watercolor can't absorb. I'm using mainly earth tones of yellow, orange, red, and brown for my fox's coat. Red foxes also have black fur along their legs and ears, and while I will use true black in those areas, I find that black fur often has dark purple undertones. Here I'm blocking in the black fur with a Prismacolor pencil called Black Grape. This is a great color. It's a beautiful dark violet that's not too intense, so it's perfect for getting those violet undertones in dark fur. This scene is a composite of multiple photo references that I've taken. The position of the fox is based on a taxidermy specimen that I photographed at a natural history museum. I liked the body position of that fox, but because it was indoors, the artificial lighting looked harsh and unnatural in my photograph. But I've also been lucky enough to photograph red foxes in the wild, so I'm using a few of those photos as a reference for what my fox's fur color should look like in natural lighting. And the landscape around the fox is based on images of the New Jersey coast in late winter, when dense fog and overcast days are quite common. Because I have a few different reference photos of foxes, I'm combining them together in my drawing and using the parts of each photo that I like. I'm using the photos to help me block in color and to check my fox's anatomy, but I'm not trying to create an exact replica of a photo. I just want to periodically check to make sure my fox feels realistic and natural. If you've never worked from multiple photo references before, it can be a bit tricky, and if you're just starting out, it might be easier to either work from life by setting up a still life in front of you, or to choose just one reference photo to work from. This will allow you to focus on getting comfortable with the materials without the added complication of having multiple references. But working this way does give me a lot of freedom in my drawing. Rather than being tied to copying a reference photo, I can make up my own composition and change or manipulate things as I see fit. I frequently sharpen my pencils because I find it easier to achieve an even and consistent application of color when my pencils are sharp. My favorite sharpener is this simple handheld one by Coom, but that's just my personal preference. There are a number of good pencil sharpeners available, and if you find hand sharpening tedious, you can always opt for an electric sharpener. As I'm working, I'm using some small strokes to indicate the direction of the fox's fur, but I'm not worried about drawing individual hairs. I'm more concerned with blocking in the main areas of light and dark, so you'll see that in some areas, I'm laying the colored pencil down more as a flat color, rather than trying to capture the fur's texture. At this point, which is still early in the shading process, it's more important to get the value and color relationships mapped out. I can work on tight detail later. I toned my mixed media board with this light blue-gray color for two reasons. The color helps to set the mood for a foggy, overcast environment, and it also contrasts really nicely with the rich orange, red, and brown colors found in the fox's fur. As I mentioned in Lesson 2, I always try to consider my surface and choose a color that works well with my subject matter and composition. Once I have the basic colors and values mapped out on my little fox, I'm going to add a layer of watercolor on top, similar to the technique I used in Lesson 2 for adding fluid acrylic. I'm mixing a few colors that are close to the colors in the fox's fur, and I'm adding a lot of water to the mix in order to keep the paint very transparent. The watercolor isn't meant to cover up my colored pencil. I want it to deepen and saturate the colors that are already there. At this point, I'm still not worrying about tight details and fur texture, so when I apply the watercolor, I'm laying it down as a flat wash of color. I'll occasionally make some small strokes to suggest fur, but I'm only using a few colors, so as the paint dries, it's drying to more of an even, flat coating. I'm once again using a paper towel to blot my brush and control the amount of paint loaded on the brush. I'm using a yellow-orange color for the lighter areas of her fur, and an orange-brown color for the darker areas of fur. I'm testing out the colors on my scrap mixed media paper before applying them to my drawing. When I apply watercolor to areas of black fur, I'm using a dark gray with violet undertones, and I'm using a lighter version of that gray in the shadow areas of her white fur. My fox isn't too large, so I really need only a small amount of watercolor to cover her, and the application of this watercolor layer is a fairly quick process. It usually takes me much longer to mix the correct colors than it does to actually put those colors on my drawing. While the watercolor on my fox is drying, I'm going back to the landscape to add some colored pencil. Right now, the landscape is still completely watercolor, so it appears smoother and more ephemeral than my fox, which has the textural quality of colored pencil and feels more solid. So I want to get some of that colored pencil texture into the foreground area of my landscape. This will help the landscape and fox look and feel more integrated. Adding more detail to the foreground will help to visually bring it forward, and it will also cause the background to feel even further back. This will help enhance the atmospheric effect that I'm trying to create. I mentioned in Lesson 1 that one of the colored pencil brands I use is Derwent Drawing. This line has 24 colors and they're all beautiful muted earth tones. So these are the perfect pencils to use for the grass and vegetation in my landscape. Each colored pencil brand has their own unique line of colors, and each of the brands that I use have colors that I can't find anywhere else, which is part of the reason I mix and match different brands. But if you've already invested in a set of pencils and you find that there's colors you don't have, but wish you did, you can always add a few open stock pencils from another brand or line to fill out your color range. Now that my fox is dry, I can go back in with colored pencil and further develop my drawing. This is when I'm going to really start adding my fine detail. I'm pushing the white areas of her fur lighter and I'm further darkening the shadow areas. I'm adding small linear strokes to suggest fur and make my fox look more fuzzy. I'm adding more detail in her face, and I've added some extra colors to my colored pencil pile in order to get the subtle gradations and color changes in the fur. I'm also adding some white strokes into the orange parts of the fur to give her coat more texture and the appearance of being really thick. Developing the drawing with these smaller details is when the personality of my subject really starts to come out. As I've added more texture and volume to my fox's fur, the edges of her face have widened a bit, giving her an extra fluffy look. And as I further detail her face, her eyes become more specific and individualized. These details weren't really part of my original sketch, but things always change slightly once I start shading and developing my drawing. As long as I'm happy with how the piece is progressing, I don't worry about whether it looks exactly like my original sketch. Of course, if something gets too far from my initial idea and I don't like how a piece is progressing, then I may need to make corrections. But sometimes, such as in this case, I like the developments and I just roll with it. I find that no matter how much planning I do, there's always a few surprises or accidents as I work. This is just part of the drawing process for me, and I personally find it fun and exciting. Now that my fox has more detail, I feel as though my landscape should be a bit more detailed as well. I don't have a set method of how many times I go back and forth between the colored pencil and watercolor. As I mentioned in the previous lesson, I really let the drawing dictate my process, so I'll go back and forth as many times as needed until my drawing feels complete. I'm adding more color and detail to the landscape to make the grass feel fuller and more substantial. And while I have my brush handy, I'm also darkening a few of the shadow areas on my fox. Even though I'm adding more watercolor to the entire landscape, I'm making sure to keep the background very light. I don't want to lose the sense of fog and atmospheric perspective, so I'm only adding darker color in the foreground. And once the watercolor has dried, I'm going back in with colored pencil one more time to add a few more details into the foreground and middle ground of the landscape. The ground just didn't feel substantial enough, so I'm adding one last layer of colored pencil to give it a little more color and texture. It's often difficult to know exactly when a piece is finished, especially when it's so easy to go back and forth between mediums. Sometimes it feels as though I could keep adding detail forever, and I've definitely had drawings that I thought were finished, only to change my mind after a day or two and continue to work on them. But because I want to maintain the feeling of fog and mist, I don't want this piece to get overworked or too detailed, especially in the background. So I think this is a good point to wrap it up and call my little fox finished. In next week's video, I'll be discussing techniques for combining pen and ink with colored pencil, and I'll be showing the process of completing a drawing from start to finish. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next week.